Hey everybody, this is Miss Peachy from WCA Biology A, and I'm trying out something a little bit different with you guys. With this biology, biology can be kind of a tricky class full of lots of vocabulary words and difficult concepts that might be unfamiliar to you. So my plan is to have a little recorded video, kind of a support and explanation for each of your lessons here in biology. And hopefully for those of you who need it, this might help you to kind of better understand the content that you're reading about here in your lessons. So we are in Unit 2, Lesson 2 of Biology A. So this is your first real content-specific lesson, and you'll see a picture of a calico cat here, and she's very pretty and looks like a beautiful spring day there where the calico kitty is sitting. And it talks about this kitty and says that most calico cats are female, and we know this because of the genes of the calico cats. This is actually encoded within their DNA. And so this is kind of an introduction to what DNA actually is. So the lesson is here on the right. My whiteboard is here on the left, so I'll kind of be elaborating a little bit on the whiteboard, but kind of reading through the lesson with you to help you understand what it is that you're reading. So start by examining the relationships among DNA, genes, and chromosomes. So DNA is also known as deoxyribonucleic acid. It is a long nucleic acid molecule found in the nucleus of a cell. So let's review what a nucleus actually is, okay? So you have your cell, right? And in a eukaryotic cell, so a eukaryotic cell or a eukaryote is a cell that contains a nucleus that houses the DNA and also a lot of different organelles, which we'll be kind of going over a little bit more in the upcoming lessons. These are the cells that make up all multicellular organisms. So, for example, I'm a multicellular organism. The calico cat in the lesson is also a multicellular organism. There are also some single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic, things like protists, little amoeba, and things like that. So there are little kind of smaller eukaryotic organisms as well, but we're looking at multicellular organisms right now. So in a eukaryotic organism, among other organelles, you have a centrally located, this is our nucleus. So here within the nucleus, you have many different things, okay, but you also have your DNA. So I'm just going to kind of write a long chain molecule of our DNA there. Not a very pretty picture, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be beautiful. That's where we find it. So let's explore more about DNA. Since it's right here, a long nucleic acid molecule found in the nucleus, it contains the coded genetic information for making proteins. So it's basically like instructions, and it tells your cell how to make these things called proteins. And proteins make a lot of different things. They can make your body's tissues, like muscles and things like that. They can make hormones and other types of chemicals in your body that transmit messages. They really can make all sorts of different things in your body. It's kind of an instructional location. DNA is wrapped around these things called histone proteins. So I'm going to kind of click and drag this over here. And actually, I had this selected, but I want to use a slightly smaller size pen because that was a little bit big. So we have this long chain DNA, right? We have these proteins called histones. And again, I'm going to make this guy smaller too. I'll just call them hist because I'm running. Not the best, right? But what the DNA does is it wraps around these. So it comes and it kind of wraps itself around the histones, and then there'll be another histone, and the DNA will wrap itself around that histone. And it just kind of keeps them, It keeps it kind of more compact so that it's not just this long string, but it's actually more tightly packed into that little tiny spot that it has to be. So the histones are proteins. And they help to package up the DNA into something smaller so that it can be easily contained in the nucleus. So yeah, histones are also made by the cell. The messages or the instructions to make the histones are coded within the DNA itself, which is kind of weird, right? So all these things together, when it's all wrapped up and packaged together with the histones, we call this compact structure a chromosome. So the entire structure of your DNA wrapped around histones is called a chromosome, and it can contain thousands of genes along its length. Human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we actually have 23 long segments of DNA all wrapped in histones, each one of them containing thousands of genes, right? But every organism has a different number of chromosomes. So cats have 19, but a fruit fly, which is quite a simple organism, only contains 4. So it depends on the organism as to how many chromosomes you actually have. The DNA molecule is sometimes called a double helix because it resembles a twisted ladder or zipper. So it has 2 different sides to it. So when you look at a DNA molecule, you're oftentimes going to see a picture that looks kind of like this, where it has, and I'm actually going to color these slightly different so we can kind of see. But it's got our 2 sides like that, right? All twisted together, kind of like that. And in between the 2 sides, you're going to see that there's these little bridges that kind of, my picture again isn't beautiful, but they're like rungs on a ladder and they connect, in this case, the yellow side to the brown side, right? So this is kind of our structure of DNA. And remember that this picture here that I just drew is basically what this green thing is supposed to represent here. So if you can imagine this twisted rung twisting all around the histones all up through here. We're just kind of zooming in a little bit to make a clearer picture. Now, the yellow and the brown here are the backbones of our DNA, and that is made up of 2 parts, these phosphate groups and something called a deoxyribose, which is a sugar. So it's a phosphate sugar backbone is what we call it. And I don't think it's super important to get very specific about that at this point. We'll just know that that's what the little yellow and brown parts are here, okay? That this yellow and brown parts are our phosphate sugar backbone. And that sugar, the name of that sugar is deoxyribose sugar. And that's important because we'll have another type of sugar we'll talk about later, which is called ribose sugar, which is very, very similar to deoxyribose sugar, with the exception that it has an additional oxygen group, which is why it's called ribose sugar and not deoxy, meaning there was less of an oxygen there. Okay, we're going to keep scrolling here. Each rung, so now let's look at those rungs of the ladder. Each rung of the ladder is made up of a pair of nitrogenous bases, and we have 4 different nitrogenous bases. So if we zoom in on our rung of the ladder, so we've got our, just a little part of this we're going to look at. So we've got our sugar phosphate group here, and we're going to look at this rung of the ladder, right? And we've got different bases. We have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Okay, so we'll write the names of those down here as well. So A is for adenine. and T is for thymine. And these two are always partners in DNA. Okay, so these are always together. Okay, and then we have cytosine. Sometimes this whiteboard's a little hard to write on my touchscreen monitor. And guanine. And again, in DNA, these two are partners. So whenever you have one side that has adenine, the other side, to be able to bond together, will always have to have thymine when you're working up with DNA. That's only true in DNA, but something you need to know. Okay, so then I said adenine always pairs with thymine, cytosine always pairs with guanine. The segment of DNA that makes up a single gene may have between 100 and 2 million bases. So when we look at our DNA then, right, let's say we look at this picture of DNA here. Remember, this thing is really, really long, but there might be only a little segment of it. And this is not the best scale picture here. But if you have a hugely long set of DNA, only a chunk of it might be a gene. So genes may have anywhere from 100 to 2 million different pairs to make up a gene, but that's only one chunk of the whole strand of DNA. Each gene codes for a specific trait. Think about it as if it is you. If you know anything about coding in computers, if you're coding for like a whole program and there's one little or just a few little lines of code that code for one part of that program. So your DNA is a whole program to build you, and there's little chunks called genes in there that code for just a little part of you, and that's what a gene is. So here's some pictures. Whoops. Here we have our cell with the nucleus, right? And you can see the little chromosomes in here. Now, a chromosome, remember, is all the DNA as it's been wound around the histones. That makes up a chromosome. And normally that's super long and windy, except during the process of cell division, right before mitosis takes place, it will kind of like form these recognizable X-like structures here. Okay, so here we have our chromosome. Oops, it does that to me all the time. And then if you look at that, that's made up of DNA, which has the phosphate sugar backbone. And then we have our adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine nitrogenous bases that are linked together. Now that's what it is in a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells, again, are like us. You and me and animals and fungi and plants and any multicellular organism, along with some single-celled organisms such as protists. Okay, let's keep reading. Cells can be classified as prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells do not contain a nucleus, but eukaryotic cells do. The DNA structure discussed so far has been the same in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. However, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells package their DNA very differently. In order to pack DNA into chromosomes and chromosomes into eukaryotic cells, the DNA molecule is tightly wrapped around a type of protein called a histone. Each intertwined DNA histone complex is then coiled into a bead-like structure called a nucleosome. Nucleosomes are packed together to form rope-like structures called chromatin. The chromatin is further condensed into the X-shaped chromosomes that most people associate with chromosomes. It's important to understand that these familiar X-shaped chromosomes only form during cell division. Chromosomes are loose chromatin when the cell is not dividing. So there's a lot of jargon in here, and essentially what it's telling you is that because we have to pack all of our chromosomes into a tiny little nucleus, it has to be squinched in there really, really tight. So it's coiled around the histones, and then those histones are packed together with chromatin to make them even smaller. And so that's how it's able to fit inside the nucleus. A lot of times we think of chromosomes as being this X shape here, which is very familiar to a lot of people, but this X shape only appears during a special time in a cell's life when the cell is getting ready to divide, and that time is called mitosis, and then we see that X shape, but normally it's not really in that shape all the time. Moving on, it says prokaryotic cells are very different from eukaryotic cells in how they handle their DNA. First, prokaryotic cells typically only have a single chromosome, so they don't have, like, we have 23, remember, 23 pairs, 46 total. Prokaryotic cells have one, and it's usually circular instead of linear, being a straight line, as in eukaryotes, right? All prokaryotic chromosomes are small compared to the chromosomes of eukaryotes because of these differences. Prokaryotes do not need histones in order to package their chromosomes into the cell. They also do not need to condense the chromosomes before cell division, as most eukaryotics do. And that's important, again, because they don't have to package their DNA into the nucleus, because prokaryotes, they don't have nucleuses. Oops, let me get this little guy out of there. So a prokaryotic cell would be a cell like a bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotic cells. They're super small. Here. So they're much, much smaller. In fact, the whole cell is, can fit very easily inside of a eukaryotic cell. They oftentimes have like little structures called cilia or flagella on the outside. And bacteria is probably the primary example. Kind of looks like a sun, doesn't it? So their chromosome, they have one, remember, and it's usually in a circular structure inside. And that's pretty much it. They don't have to wind them around histones. They don't have to package them or anything like that. So they're very simple. All right, so moving on here. As stated previously, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of these chromosomes carry genes that code for proteins in our body tissues need in order to function. The 23rd pair of chromosomes contains genes that code for our sex characteristics. All humans have one X chromosomes. So we all have one X chromosome, right? So let's move on here a little bit. We have both females and males, right, have a single X chromosome. Females have two X's and males do not have a second X, they have a Y. So the genetic determination for sex is in the chromosomes, XX for female, XY for males. So this is just our genetics sex determination. So this sex determination system is used by humans and most mammals and even some insects. It's not true across the board for all animals, or all organisms, I should say. The two members of a chromosome pair may or may not be identical. So more than likely they're not identical, by the way. So as females, we have X and we got a second X. Just because these both code for female characteristics doesn't mean they have the exact same genes on each one. They all carry the same set of genes, but each gene might be slightly different. For example, now this isn't true for sex chromosomes, but for example, you might be inheriting in a regular cell, regular gene, you might be inheriting like blue eyes on one of your chromosomes and brown eyes on the other chromosomes. So you have two different versions. We call those alleles. That's the word. We'll actually get to that in a later lesson. Allele is like the version of a gene, like the different type of gene. They have the same, they code for the same thing, they're just slightly different variations, a different variation of that gene. That's probably a better way of saying it. Okay, it says one chromosome in a pair may have the gene that codes for brown eyes, whereas the same gene on the other chromosome might code for blue eyes. Some traits can be expressed if only one copy of a gene version is present. Other traits require two identical copies. These different versions are known as alleles. So let's define that real quick. So this is like a variation. I like that word best. Of a gene. Bad writing, huh? Blue. It's just the pen. It's kind of too soft. Versus brown eyes. All right, so there's your summary of the content from Unit 2, Lesson 2. Join me for the next summary.